is none. So that's that. And if that's robust, I suppose it's 100% more. Yeah, I'd like 100% more, I guess, since there is none. I'm more focused in on a wide range of things, not regulation necessarily. One is obviously some regulation, mostly around data and privacy regulation and bills in terms of knowing what people are. So that's that. And if that's robust, I suppose it's 100% more. Yeah, I'd like. Who's that?
That was you. It was you on loopback, weirdly.
Oh, all right. Okay. So anyway, so I would look at data and privacy regulation. I think it's critically important in this country. At least we don't have much of it to speak of. I would look at some antitrust, but not very much. I think it's a really ineffective tool for the most part, and it's slow in coming. And in some cases, it's adequate. It's warranted. In other cases, not. The only thing it does serve is to slow down these companies from just taking the whole landscape, and which had happened with Microsoft and others. So it's a tool in that regard, letting the windows open so other people can slip through. I believe in some liability. In some cases, there is none right now. So in some cases, there being some level of liability and such. And the other one I believe in is taxes on certain things, which is taxing certain online advertising, and then just the way we do cigarettes or things like that. That's something I believe in. So it's sort of a more wide-ranging thing, because I don't believe there's only one catch-all solution. I think there's lots of them, and we haven't really deployed any. And the last one is obviously, societal impact. The societal impact is sort of these businesses should be proud of what they're doing and their impact on society, and that's been used for years. I don't think it's a particularly effective tool, but sometimes it can be. It usually ends up being mostly PR from these companies about how they're here for our best interests. And so those are the things I would look at. I'm not for robust regulation. I don't think there's going to be any regulation around speech. I don't think there's a possibility to do that in this country, at least. Certainly in other countries, that's the case.
Great. All right, Clay.
Yeah. So I mean, I think we agree about quite a lot of this, including the idea that there's no one sort of regulatory lever that anybody can grab. There's going to be a series of overlapping tools. I will talk a little bit about something I'm worried about in the larger environment, not that is, I think, relatively in line with what Cara just said, although she will tell me after I'm done. But there's this attitude among a number of outside critics of people looking in from the outside at what big tech has wrought in society, and it's an attitude I've called "burn it all down." Right, the idea that you could essentially fundamentally reorganize all of this, and it would almost certainly be better than what we've got. A really concrete example showed up just a couple of weeks ago. Timothy Egan, one of Cara's colleagues at the New York Times, wrote an op-ed about misinformation, and at one point he proposes repealing Section 230, which is the section that essentially lets these companies regulate via their terms of service, regulate speech on their platform via their terms of service. And he said, if we repeal 230, this could mean the end of the internet as we know it. That's true, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. And I worry about that burn it all down attitude, because I think it is relatively prevalent now. The frustration with the inability to do anything to the tech giants has led, I think, to a kind of nihilism. And I have a little bit of an unusual biography here for an American, which is that for much of the last decade, in the sort of middle part of the last decade, I lived in Shanghai. And I was there in the years in which the Xi Jinping regime changed the public Chinese rhetoric around censorship from essentially denying that they did very much of it to turning it into a kind of patriotic good. And what I saw, the public was very, very supportive of Chinese censorship of the internet. But the two things I saw were that censorship regimes always tend to expand. That, when you take, say, the Egan argument, the government should effectively be able to label certain things misinformation and then intervene. That if censorship regimes expand and we put the tools in anyone's hands to label something misinformation, just the range of things that could be included can always grow larger. And two, something I think that the Democratic coalition, liberals, leftists, progressives, however you want to label the group of people who vote Democratic, there is, I think, a sense that censorship can be used as a tool of righteousness. And censorship, the ability to declare something misinformation and beyond the pale for public discussion, censorship is almost invariably a tool of power. And it's nice when righteousness and power line up, but they're absolutely not joined at the hip. This is an abstract worry, of course, in any regime that tries to control speech. But right now in the United States, it is a very particular worry in that Democrats could easily lose the House in 2022. We could easily lose the House, the Senate, and the presidency in 2024. And the idea of essentially revoking Section 230 and subjecting these businesses to essentially whatever regime content control replaces it worries me in the abstract, but it worries me especially imagining a Republican president and Congress in 2024. And I know, Sasha, that the Persuasion that you all put a lot of weight on touring the weak points of an argument as well. So I'll also say that the weakest part of the argument against the sort of labeling of misinformation has been that the 21st century has been really terrible to the affirmative argument against censorship, right? The American 20th century argument that the answer to bad information is more information, there's a marketplace of ideas, sunlight is the best disinfectant. For 20 years, science has been chasing down all of the ways in which that doesn't actually line up with the way the human mind works. That instead of the 20th century belief that humans are basically rational with a few irrational quirks, it turns out that whatever the human brain was evolved for, sustained rational thought isn't high on the list. And now we've seen a 5-year test case of that same set of intuitions from behavioral economics and evolutionary psychology and all the rest of it. But we have a group of people willing to deny that deadly pandemics are deadly and that life-saving vaccines are life-saving. So I should make it clear that even as I worry about this, even as I worry about the worry about misinformation, the affirmative case for the freedom of speech, which has been, bread and butter among American liberals for nearly 100 years, has been sorely tested and comes out severely weakened. So although I am willing to say this is not a loaded gun liberals should want hanging around the house, I also recognize that I can't say wonderful things will happen when all ideas are allowed to flourish, which puts me in a complicated position.
So let's talk about this piece on speech. I think there's two questions here. One is how might state action and regulation change the extent to which there is free speech on the internet? And the question here really is about what the effect would be of reforming or abolishing Section 230, and the worry that you just put, Clay, about what that might mean in the hands of politicians you dislike. So I would love to just make it clear for the group what exactly it would look like to abolish Section 230 and what
we're not going to do that. That's not happening. That's not going to occur in any face, shape, or form. I'd be shocked by it. President Trump already tried it in kind of a weird kindergarten way to do it by executive order. But the problem is reform is what you might see on parts of it, and there's all kinds of ways people are talking about how to do this. And I think one of the things that's critically important is to recognize, and I think the tech companies will rightly make the right arguments that this is devastating to exactly the goals that people are trying to find, which is more speech or responsibility for speech. So what happens is two things get messed up. There's responsibility for speech and consequences of speech, and then there's freedom of speech. These companies have a freedom of speech in being allowed to do what they're doing. And one of the things that's difficult to legislate in any way is to create a situation where you're forcing them to do things they don't need to do as private businesses. One of the problems we've gotten into is that I know Justice what's his name? Justin, Justin, the one that never speaks. Anyway, Thomas, excuse me. He just did this whole thing about it being a utility, which is really, he only did it in short order. It wasn't in a long thing, but it's this idea that they should be regulated as if they're a public square. And the fact, I think that's the general idea, the public square, there's some sort of social utility, is the where some people are going to with this idea, is that's how you regulate them, by moving them from speech to a utility kind of thing. So you treat it like the electric company or something like that. And that's the way they're going to go. That's the way around it. If you started to see him do it, and you see that reiterated by a lot of people. And one of the things that's ironic about it is when I first met Mark Zuckerberg, that's the exact word he used to me the first time we met, was that Facebook was more like a utility than anything else. He kept calling it a utility. And the reason he was doing so at the time was because MySpace was super hip and all the cool kids loved it. And Facebook was where not the cool kids were. And so he was trying to differentiate himself from why it was blue, why it was boring looking, why the design was sort of ham-handed compared to the excitement and all the bells and whistles at MySpace. And so when you think of it in terms of a utility, you could possibly go down that road, but I don't think anybody is willing to entertain what Justice Thomas was talking about. Because these are private companies doing private things in private squares, however much they might feel like it. It's more like opiate companies affecting society. Like that's really where the rub is at. And then the power that these companies have over everybody. And my concern is not as much the free speech argument, is the power concentration. So look at the Donald Trump situation around the election. Most people feel that he broke the laws over and over again on these platforms, on these private platforms. They finally took them off when they didn't want to become handmaids to sedition. That finally was a bridge too far for them. And then everybody was like, yay, they'd made the right decision. Well, they made the right decision, but it was two people at two companies that stopped the whole thing. So what I was more interested in is not that it wasn't the right decision, because I think it was, because it was long overdue, but that it was done by two people, and it is a concentration of power. And I think if we tend to like get all screaming at each other about the free speech part, if you discuss the power dynamics around it and who has the concentration of power, it solves the problems both the right and the left seem to have, which is that there's only one or two arbiters of these kind of things. And so if we're relying on Mark Zuckerberg to make all our societal decisions, I can tell you, people, we are not. And by the way, he's a very nice young man.
So let me. I just want to try and get some sort of basic background on the table to make sure that people can follow this. So Section 230 is essentially saying that a lot of these internet companies, whether social media platforms and so on, aren't responsible for the user-generated content on them legally.
They have broad immunity. It's different. It's not they're not responsible, because they are responsible in some. They have broad immunity in order to be able to police it, so that they're not legally responsible for libelous things, etc. And it was part of a bigger bill that mostly was declared unconstitutional.
Right. So the point is that sort of one thing to do would be to reform Section 230 in order to take away some of the immunities they currently have for being responsible in certain ways for the content of their users, right? Mm-hmm. The other question, which I think is different, it's not about government, but it is, as you bring up, Kara, about the control of a few people, is that you might not get any political legislation, or you might get some kind of legislation, and yet be in a position in which essentially 2 or 3 people in Silicon Valley get to make a decision as to which politician has a platform and which politician is effectively banned from the public sphere. And
once they break
may be particular cases.
They have to break the laws. They have to look. I know.
Well, no, but we don't know that, right? I mean, in principle, there's nothing stopping Facebook and Twitter from banning Bernie Sanders if he calls for the breakup of these companies. We may not think that that's currently likely culturally, because of
their rules.
These companies and the kind of backlash it might have.
Yeah, but he broke their rules. There was just no way.
But whether or not that's the case, the question is that I want to understand. We're now currently in a place where whether or not we want to legally call Facebook and Twitter public utilities or not, they do effectively act as the public sphere,
but they aren't.
The United States. And if you are banned from those platforms, it does make it very, very hard to take part in the actual political conversation that is going on. And so at the moment, there's a few people in Silicon Valley who effectively have the power to exile people, including elected politicians, from full participation in the public sphere in the United States. And I guess my question is that a sustainable course of state of affairs? And if not, how can we change that? You spoke, Kara, to breaking up the monopolies in some kind of way, or to making sure there's not this concentration of power. It's not clear to me what that would look like or how that might work. So
innovation.
Let's get
Clay, go first.
Yeah,
Clay. One really interesting answer that's being floated now on the right, which also has an incentive, although for very different outcomes, is to begin to limit the ability of very large companies to engage in mergers and acquisitions. And one of the things I think we've seen in the concentration of power with Facebook is that the imagination of the people looking at antitrust law lags the state of both technology and public adoption by so much that Facebook was allowed to acquire both Instagram and WhatsApp without really any significant questioning of whether or not that was going to be a good idea. And the interesting thing to me about the sort of, at a certain scale, you can no longer acquire it, you can no longer grow through acquisition, is it takes it out of the decision-making hands and makes it a structural element of the economy. But I think more generally, the question of competition is the answer to be looking for. I am less optimistic, I have to say, than Kara about the idea that because the rules are published, they're gonna work as they should.
No, they enforce them terribly. We both agree.
Okay. So then I'm overreading that. I will take that back from your observation, Kara. But I will say that Zoom recently censored, in fact, pulled the Zoom links from a number of conversations that were going to feature Laila Houed, who is a member of the, I believe it's People's Front for the Liberation of Palestine is the name of the group, which is itself a US designated foreign terrorist organization. Zoom's logic was that this was going to be a violation of US law, but in fact, the mechanism they used to do it was their terms of service. And when people pointed out that because of the way Khaled was being invited to these events, it was quite arguably not a legal violation of this particular section of the U.S. Code, Zoom can always just fall back on the section of their terms of service that says basically we can cut anybody off at any time for any reason or no reason. Yeah. So there's a although terms of service provide a great deal of freedom to act by these companies, as they did around Trump and many of the instigators of the January 6th insurrection, that was an extreme case that doesn't, I think, yet provide a lot of, and certainly for me, doesn't yet provide a lot of confidence in terms of service as a real source of leverage.
Yeah, I think the issue is how it reforms, and I think my focus is more on innovation in order to. I think antitrust is the slowest moving tool, and you talk to anyone at the Justice Department, they say that it's just a slower downer is what it tends to work out as. And I think the issue is there's going to be no restrictions on free speech by the Congress, at least as it says that in the First Amendment, and so they won't be able to do that. But they have other levers around behavior around these companies, including the concentration of power in, say, Google with search, which the Trump administration already waged that battle, and looks like the Biden administration is not shifting that and is continuing forward with that. There's the FTC case against Facebook, which will look at a lot of things. And then the most interesting part of all these different things where nobody pays attention, and I think Clay just referred to acquisitions, not just major acquisitions, but the small acquisitions, which they had emails where Zuckerberg was saying this, which was, we have to own the landscape, we have to neutralize. It's words that Gates used before. I think we've got to buy, kill, or whatever. He had three things, like buy, copy, or kill. Kill, right, exactly. And so I think in that way, if they're starting to look at the smaller acquisitions, which are just killer acquisitions, essentially, which is just to snuff them out before they're born, essentially, that's really where the interesting stuff is. And when they start to study why they make those decisions, I think you're going to find a lot more interesting material, especially in the emails and how they talk about these things, because that's really, innovation is the only way. I mean, listen, AOL dominated everything and then it didn't, kind of thing. And so innovation of new things is the only way that's really going to take care of this thing, at least in this country. But until then, there's got to be certain tools, whether it be taxing, whether it could be acquisitions, which I think you're absolutely right, Clay, about that. But there's not going to be any, there's just not going to be any legislation around free speech. I just don't see there's no, as much as they scream and yell, it's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen unless they designate these companies public utilities. They could do that. And I know people in the audience are saying, well, they are it doesn't matter if they are, if you think they are, they aren't. They actually aren't legally that. And so that has to happen. And I don't know if there's a lot of stomach for doing that. Particularly, I haven't seen it legislated.
Let me ask a question about innovation and incumbency. So I think there's obviously a particular problem when there's a few companies that have managed to become so dominant that they can snuff out the competition by, buying or copying or
not always.
But I guess what I'm wondering is how much would be solved if there was more fluidity? If it turns out that Facebook as a platform really dies and nobody uses it anymore 5 or 10 years from now. And instead we're all on some new platform that we don't even know the name of yet. But isn't there a platform effect where you want to be on the platform which everybody else is on as well? And wouldn't that mean that at any one time, there's always going to be somebody who's powerful enough to essentially decide who's part of a political discourse and who's not. So how can we go? I agree that it's a better world where there's real competition and companies that are now dominant may no longer be dominant 5 or 10 years ago. But the sort of concerns about at any one point, there will be somebody who has tremendous power, who has the ability of deciding what is part of a public debate and what is not allowed to be part of a public debate, will always stay the same, even in that model. So how do we go beyond that?
I mean, we used to be worried about Steve Case rather than Mark Zuckerberg, right? There was Friendster owned the social graph landscape until MySpace came along. MySpace till Facebook. Facebook had one structural advantage, which is that they were able to operate in an environment which had already proved out the model. And the other environment was that after Murdoch bought MySpace, he deeply did not understand what he had bought and tried to milk it for advertising dollars rather than letting it grow. But over the long term, both WhatsApp and Instagram would have been profound challenges to Facebook. And Facebook's genius was that they understood when other people had gotten their finger on the pulse.
Yeah.
So I don't think, Yasha, that this is quite as baked into sort of network effects as you imagine, because a world in which literally those two acquisitions, if they'd acquired everything else they've ever acquired and not those two companies, they would be
finished.
Right.
They'd be finished. And one of the things that's interesting to think about is, look, what did he just announce this week on his press tour of people, not me or anybody who wants to ask tough questions, although Casey Newton tried his very best. What did they announce this week?
So he or they being who?
Mark Zuckerberg. What did Facebook?
Oh, the copy of Clubhouse, you mean?
Copy of Clubhouse, which, by the way, they have cross investors. Mark Andreessen is on the board of Facebook and is a big investor. His firm is a big investor in Clubhouse and also Substack, which Mark is also copying in their thing. And so what they tend to do is do a lot of copies, some of which work and some of which don't. Instagram copied stories from Snapchat. It worked. Copies Snapchat all the time, and then took to copying TikTok, hasn't worked as well. Took to copying dating services, didn't really work as well. Certain things work and certain things don't. Sometimes they just announce it, probably just to say we have our finger in here. But the idea of Facebook being able to buy Clubhouse would be problematic, I would say, right now, because it's the top one. One of the things that's more interesting is that Facebook doesn't always succeed at the things they try to do. That's sort of same thing happened to Microsoft. Actually, they tried to get, if you remember, the MSNBC. They tried to do all kinds of things that didn't really work out for them in any way, and then they moved back into their area. But what's interesting to look at is what areas are competitive. Where is their competition? Autonomous vehicles. or electric vehicles, all transportation stuff. There is actually a lot of, even though it's getting more and more concentrated in cloud computing, it's actually getting more. It used to just be Amazon. Now it's, Google or Oracle, et cetera, food innovation, energy innovation, climate change innovation. These are all widely, there's just all kinds of players there now. And so when you have to think about whether what might happen is this might not be as important. There could be maybe interoperable social services that you just have an online identity. It's not a Facebook identity. It just Facebook monitors it and they all interoperate with each other. That's one idea where they move, where your personality moves all around the internet, essentially, which was the original idea. Sometimes I do feel that history will take care of this, just like they did in other ways. But if Facebook's allowed to buy things or Google's allowed to buy things, that's where you're not going to, or online advertising, that's where there's certain areas we really have to be very careful around, and others sort of just wait for the market to work itself out.
And I want to double back a little bit, Yash, on the regulatory front. I completely agree with Kara about innovation and competition essentially changing the landscape all the time. But I am more pessimistic about regulatory changes to free speech. Kara, I'm interested to hear you say nobody's going to touch 230 in a major way, or certainly nobody's going to repeal it. And up thread in the comments, Christopher at one point said there's no legal rationale for regulating speech. But the history of free speech in the United States is the history of ad hoc and post hoc rationalizations, either by the FCC or the Supreme Court, around speech they don't like. The government facing the proliferation of low power radio, the FCC was essentially formed to have a preference for a small number of large radio stations rather than a large number of small radio stations. The $10 word for this is institutional isomorphism, but all it means is that institutions prefer to deal with other institutions that look like them. So if you're the US government, you'd much, much rather deal with a small number of large media outlets than a large number of small media outlets. And I am, again, partly worried about the sort of burn it down rationale right now, because I think there is some danger that people will just invent, and by people I mean the FCC or the Supreme Court, will effectively invent rationales for reining in speech that we would think would be protected by the First Amendment, but under some new doctrine like time, place, and manner restrictions, or malls only having to host speech that's relevant to their business dealings. The subsequent rationalizations can actually have fairly profound effects. Mm-hmm. So I don't think that Congress will get it together. It's a fairly dysfunctional body right now, but I do think that there are other regulatory avenues.
Possibly, if they get funded. I mean, one of the things that's interesting is, what are they? That's really where we have to decide. Are they publishers? Are they platforms? And there's a word, platager, which is it's an awful word. It's a terrible word. But what are they?
What does that mean, Kara?
Platager, a platform publisher. Like they're a publisher. Now, back in the old days, people don't realize this. Facebook was making a lot of content. Mark's sister used to sit in a closet at Facebook and make interviews, and then they would have Facebook News. They used to make. She really did. She had a closet at Facebook where she would do very good interviews with famous people all the time. So the question is, what are they precisely has not really been decided. Like, are they would say platform until it's not good for them, and then they'd say something else. And they're not precisely publishers. And so I think the definition of what they are is going to matter a great deal. And if they can get a government to declare them, like, look, in this George Floyd thing just now, thankfully there isn't widespread protests all over the country today, which there should have been if it was a different verdict.
Oh my God, yes.
But Facebook was the one that moved in and said, we're going to restrict. So they have some weird, I mean, I don't know what they are. Are they a safety commission? What they immediately made announcements around this. And they, of course, you want them to do that. And they did the same thing around the election a couple of weeks before. So they recognize their important and critical role. It's just no court has decided what it is. And I think probably that's where it's going to, what is it precisely? Probably the Supreme Court will ultimately decide what it is, what exactly these things are. And by the time they decide that, they may not be powerful at that point. It may be something else.
Or there may be 27 of them, who knows?
Yeah.
But,
So I want to start getting people from the audience in to ask questions in a little moment. So please feel free to raise your hand in the participants panel, and I'll get to you in a minute. Before we get there, I'd like to ask two simple questions to each of you, Clay and Kara, which is, first of all, what simple legal or regulatory change would you most cheer? What do you think is the most urgent thing to push forward and pass? And which legal or regulatory change do you most fear? Which do you think would be, whether it's realistic that it's going to be adopted or not, which would be the biggest mistake that we might make?
I think the last one, I would say the elimination of Section 230. I think it would be disastrous to all these businesses in some way. Taxes. I feel like taxes. I feel like taxes would be great. Like taxing online publishing. I would say data and privacy laws, but those are so friggin' confusing and they're badly written. So tax them. They want to sell.
Tax on the good side and abolishing.
They want to sell
on the bad
the American
side.
public. They want to have this. They want to do. Pay for what it costs. Pay for what it costs for what they're doing. To me, they're like sugar. In a lot of ways. So
price in the externality.
Yeah.
And for me, going in that same order, also the repeal of Section 230. I think Kara's point about not yet having a clear legal doctrine about what these platforms are is right. 230 is what says essentially we can't regulate them like common carriers, like the phone company. And we also can't regulate them like Hearst Publishing. And so we're going to hold open this kind of neutral space while we see this thing develop. And I went back, actually, and reread 230 just before this conversation. I was surprised by the amount of language that was about how new this thing was, right? There was this sense of, this was frontier legislation, and it will get updated. It will probably get updated in the court, but I think an outright repeal, I would like to say that would be the thing that would worry me most. For me, and I like the idea of taxes because tax bad's not good is an interesting policy regulation. But for me, it would be some structural way to prevent businesses from buying and squelching their competition. Again, because I have no hope that the congressional oversight of mergers and acquisitions can keep pace with technology. The number of times we've been treated to senators just trying to understand how their phones work, or not even understanding the business Facebook is in when they're talking to the CEO. One model is upgrade the senators, but I don't think that that's going to happen.
To be fair, some of them are quite good. That's we always get like that Marsha Blackburn saying something dumb or something like that. But a lot of them are very, like Amy Klobuchar knows what she's talking about. So does Senator Warner. There's a number of Republican senators congressmen that are very sharp on this stuff. So that it's not, and their staffs are. So I wouldn't.
So I think that's fair. It is not universal, but the problem is that because antitrust is an aggregate decision by Congress, it's not like Klobuchar gets to decide.
Right.
The net of the group of senators that is going to be making this choice is always going to be behind. And I'd like to see some structural way to put impediments in companies simply hoovering up their competition as a way of creating an environment where there's more competition.
Great. Let's go to some of the questions in the Zoom audience. For those of you watching on YouTube, if you want to participate in the conversation future event, please head to persuasion.community and become a subscriber of our wonderful magazine and community. Chad.
Hi there. I had a question about what role, if any, does public sentiment play in the kinds of regulations you would like to see over these companies? I ask in terms of like the e-privacy directive coming out of the EU, which prompts users for consent, and we see 90+% of people consenting to these things, or applications like Plaid and Mint, which asks users to give them their, their bank credentials. And it seems like the public is actually way more hungry for convenience than it is for the type of instance that we're talking about today.
Here's one of the issues. People love these companies. And by the way, during the pandemic, they've proved indispensable, right? I just published a column saying this, that they're really, it's been the biggest experiment in delivery, and now everybody loves it and everyone's doing it. It was not as widespread as it was, or whatever the different telecommuting and things. Facebook just announced that their workers don't have to go back to work at all. They can work from home. And I think that's going to be a very prevalent thing. There's certain things that didn't work, like education, very well for anybody who has kids at whatever level they are, has had a hard time. But I think the problem is these are very well-loved brands and people like using them, and the convenience is massive. And people sort of don't think about it like a lot of things. People don't think about seatbelts, and everyone wears them. I mean, most people wear them, I guess. So doesn't have to have the buy-in necessarily from the public to do the right thing, but it makes it more difficult because, people really like Amazon and they don't really think about the union or worker issues as much as, I know I don't. And so that's one of the big issues. A lot of these companies are really well liked and as brands and as what they do. One of the interesting things is sort of the internal stuff that's going on I just interviewed Tim Cook between Apple and and Facebook. And he talked about that a lot, and they're just doing it. They're just deciding to do it because it's good for their brand, by the way. Privacy is good for their brand. And so it'll be an interesting thing as Facebook doesn't have a phone. Facebook's going to have to have a phone, right? They had a terrible phone that was just.
So did Amazon have a terrible phone. The days of anybody having a phone are, I think, done.
If Facebook had a phone, that would be a problem. That would be a problem. Right. So, but they may buy LG, who knows? But what Apple's doing is really interesting to watch. That'll be interesting. Apple's also really well liked too, and so it'll be an interesting. You're not going to win on brand versus brand Congress versus brand or brand press versus brand Facebook. They're going to win.
I think the one thing I'll say that maybe expands on what Kara just said is when citizens and consumers expect corporations to behave in ways that essentially don't support restrictions of voting rights, that actually does have as we've seen, can have quite a profound effect. It's a bank shot. It's not, people in California pressuring people in Georgia. That does not work. But it is people in California saying, I am not okay with this thing, and brands that align with that, get my custom. So in a way, it's a kind of reverse boycott, which is to say rewards for the companies that come forward and do these things. That is an avenue of leverage, but I absolutely agree with Kara. Direct opposition to Amazon, direct opposition to Google, and so forth is of relatively limited value.
Monty.
Thank you. Calling from my downtown bunker in Toronto, basement bunker. I want to commend you on the conversation. As a Canadian with a legal background, working abroad under the aegis of the UN in regions post-conflict, my issue is that of what I term as a fiduciary, and that has an entailment in terms of civics, because we're dealing with, and I'm in terms of computers or technology, a Luddite or a very simple, it's almost a hardware, software type of issue. And the law is not able yet to grasp in terms of the fungibility, in terms of nuance. And it's almost analogous to Justice Potter, I believe, saying, I know pornography when I see it. And that to me is not sufficient. And it's almost a type of choice decision. Would you rather have unregulated, unfettered, open speech where it's messy, dirty, violent in a non-confrontational sense physically, as opposed to that which is akin to China, anodyne, everything is cement, you're ossified, there's no form of epistemic creativity. And yet how can one marry or bring a balance? And that goes into, is our political class or our political institutions sufficient, able, capable in handling or addressing this issue, notwithstanding that politics is highly transactional, and most governments, including the government in Canada, is that once you are elected, you are seeking re-election. I thank you.
Wow, I'm not sure what the question is there, but I think there is a middle ground between what's happening in China and what's happening here. I mean, the problem is when you see a lot of the stuff that's on there, if you really go into the internet, it's pretty ugly. It's pretty, like, it's an astonishing array of speech that is really disturbing on many levels. Some of it, which is, you can look away, and it should be allowed to exist. Other of which is quite harmful. And we have laws on lots of things that are harmful, to us. And I think that's always going to be this idea of whether we should have I don't think we're going to a Chinese state, but like a mommy state, kind of like you shouldn't be able to see that, versus let everybody see what they want to see and then sort it out. The problem is it does jump off the page, jump off the screen, which it did with the attack on the Capitol. There's so many bright lines of what happened there in terms of how people, and it's not the only one, by the way. Cable was part of it. Donald Trump's incessant speechifying. There's all kinds of things that went on there. But the fact of the matter is when most people get their news from two websites, which is Google and Facebook, you are going to, and that's where they live within these bad information diets. This is where it's going to lead. And because the way it's structured, because you can send a million lies to a million different people that are slightly different and organized for that one person, that's where you really get into real power in a way that's not where malevolent players get to take advantage of these things. I always say, like, look, Hitler didn't need Instagram. Like Mussolini didn't need Reddit, whatever horrible person did a horrible thing in over the history of our world and horrible things. They didn't need these things. What this does is it takes it and moves it so much faster, and it amplifies it and weaponizes it so much quicker that it moves faster than people's ability to cope with what's happened. I sit around and I go, I really don't know what the answer is. I really don't, I just don't, I have no.
And let me offer a card that I think that's true of everybody, that nobody knows what the right answer is. And I also heard in the comment, essentially a plea for a kind of almost procedural clarity, a set of laws that could be enforced because we just understand how they work. And there is almost no area of constitutional, in the US context, not the Canadian context, there is almost no area of constitutional law that's messier than free speech. It is essentially a series of judgment calls. And as Posner pointed out many years ago, no case that gets to the Supreme Court should have an obvious right answer. That effectively, if the appellate system is doing its job, the only cases that get to the Supreme Court should be ambiguous enough to need a judgment call. So instead of ever having a combination of a political class and a set of rules that affords us clarity, we're going to have to decide which kinds of things can be subjected to judgment calls, and then who can make the judgments, and then what, if any, are the avenues of appeal. And those are basically, they're lowercase p political questions, but they're political questions. And there aren't a lot of good, to echo Karen's answer, there aren't a lot of obvious answers right now. There are a lot of obvious harms. There are not a lot of obvious interventions that target those harms specifically, without opening up potential, really potential loss on a scale that I think people have a hard time imagining. I think people imagine that, the internet where people trade chili recipes and praise each other's pictures of sunsets is a kind of, it's a function like air that we all just have access to, and we can just go out and remove the obviously disturbing stuff. But in fact, the anodyne, I shouldn't use anodyne because you used that word about China, but the casual internet and the highly politicized internet all operate in the same environment. And if you adjust that environment dramatically, the side effects are going to be astonishing, which is why I was worried about Tim Egan's, this will end the internet as we know it. Maybe that's no big deal. Most of the internet, as we know, is just people doing stuff they like with their friends. The political content is a fraction of the total content.
But they do still think this way, Clay. You just saw Mark's speech on the new media, like why he thinks everybody should have a voice. Guess why? He doesn't like powerful institutions. He'd rather every writer and media person become someone noted an Uber driver, and then they would be on their platform. They don't like any concentration of power except
right, of course.
And so like leave the New York Times, leave the Wall Street Journal.
This is Ben Thompson's thing about the sovereign writer, which is, we're on our third go round of everyone's going to leave institutions and just be on their own. Mm-hmm. And the answer is some people will do that, and then those places.
And I were the first one. So anyway, yeah, right. I'm here to tell you need powerful institutions.
Yes, indeed.
MC.
Hi, Yasha. First, I want to thank you for Persuasion. I really am enjoying my subscription. I do not agree with you much on politics, but I really commend your commitment to liberalism as an ideal, and that's why I'm here. So thanks again.
Thank you very much. It's very kind of you.
Yeah, and thanks to the panel. My question is about regulation. I think that we all have seen people like Zuckerberg and the heads of the other social media companies calling out to be regulated. My concern about their unanimity and consistency in asking to be regulated is because that will create significant barriers to entry for the alternatives that might spring up. I was wondering if the panel could address that and what the concerns might be about cementing in regulations that prevent new barriers to entry.
That was the issue around GDPR, is that they have enough lawyers and public relations people and everything else to deal with some of these laws. They're going to cause, if they write them in the wrong way, it's so onerous, only very wealthy companies can deal with it and manage the situation. It's comical how many PR people Facebook has, or Twitter not so much, but and Google. I mean, they have more PR and lawyers than I think the Justice Department. There's some number that's some crazy number I saw the other day. So I think that's the issue, is if they write these wrong, all these new small companies will have to adhere to these regulations, and it's unaffordable for them to do so. There's ideas to let certain sizes not have to adhere to them, and the bigger companies to adhere to them. And so any of these I think they do want some guidance though on some level, because there's so much uncertainty around what they're doing. At the same time, from an investment perspective, they've never been more powerful. They are now at like all-time highs of all time, and they're the 10 richest people in the world are all tech people, except for I think the Saudis. I think Saudi Aramco is one of the biggest ones, but otherwise it's all tech companies. It's all tech people at the top. And what that allows them to do is be able to control whatever comes their way, and they can build whatever they need to. But they do want guardrails around facial recognition, because they don't know what to, like, what are the rules around facial recognition? What are the rules around AI? They would welcome some guidance. Our government has abrogated its responsibility we govern, even if badly, finance, which needs fixing, of course, cars, planes. The government has utterly abrogated responsibility here, and I think some of the tech companies are wanting it in a good way. But for the most part, it probably hurts. Too much regulation will hurt small companies first and most profoundly.
And the wrong kind of regulation too. MT, I was laughing when you were talking. I'm in New York State, and one of the things I've seen happen here is that small butchers, small cattle ranchers, and have grown up as a business in New York. And whenever they tried to butcher their cattle in a sort of basically more artisanal way, so we're basically keeping track of each piece of meat from each cow, they were told that they had to have a full-time FDA regulator on staff, because the rules have been written in such a way that all meat production is scale-free, which means if you own 5 cows or 5,000, you play by the same rules. And that is absolutely in place to create a huge regulatory advantage for scale. The ability that Karen mentioned to mobilize an army of lawyers and PR people means that Congress can always get rolled. I am relatively optimistic about the Biden administration's appointments in this regard, because they have some very smart people who I think are unlikely to fall for the smokescreens for, please don't throw me in that briar patch style regulation. But so much of this then comes down to Congress's willingness to act. And there, of course, the huge irony of this is that the push to allow relatively unlimited corporate money into politics was back when the Republicans assumed that U.S. corporations were inherently conservative and would therefore be inherently in the Republican category. They're now all panicking a little bit because the corporations are turning out to dislike the voting restrictions in Georgia. But I think we can't do this without some regulations, but it's absolutely the case that regulations, if written badly, could also make it worse.
So we're coming up towards the end of our conversation, and one thing that I think is striking about both of your careers in different ways is that you grew up with a lot of the optimism about the internet and a lot of the hope of how much positive potential it had. And as the mood has, for good reason, turned, about tech. You've both become more critical and more skeptical about it in certain ways. I mean, your career is
Not
quite
me.
different, so I don't want to.
I've stayed the same old grumpy pain in the ass as ever. But no, I have huge optimism for tech.
So let me ask. The question which goes towards that, which is, what, if 10 years from now or 20 years from now we look back at this moment and we say, you know what, we were in a little bit of a panic, and it's understandable why, but actually things have turned out to be really great. What will have happened in those 10 or 20 years? What will the story be that got us from this moment of pretty widespread pessimism about tech to a retrospective, well, look, we had well-founded concerns at the time, but it turned out that really we were a little too worried and things have turned out pretty great 10 or 20 years from now? What would have to happen these 10 or 20 years for that to be the case?
Well, I think a lot about television. Like, look, television when I was growing up was the boob tube, if you remember, like everyone idiotic. And now it's one of the most creative and interesting places for all kinds of shows. And it's available. There's streaming. There's dozens. You see things from all over the world. You look at that industry, and that really developed from 3 networks, at least in this country, 3 networks deciding everything of like Wednesday must-see TV or Thursday must-see, whatever it was, to something that's really quite vibrant and interesting and lots of perspectives. Like if you can go, like you can go on BritBox, you can go all over the world and watch things. And so that to me is a really interesting way to do it. The other thing is I have teen sons. I have also a baby, but the way they interact with online is a lot different. They're more skeptical. They know how to handle it. Their information diet, and that's not because they're my kids, because I don't do a lot of monitoring of their usage of the internet. But I think at some point, just like we got used to watching television, or we got used to the media literacy around this stuff will improve with the people who grew up doing it. And so my hope is that they will understand some of it is bullshit, some of it is this, some of it is that, and they're not as easily fooled and tricked and brought into, just not as easily manipulated because they have some level of media literacy. And I think it's happened with every medium, like whether it's the printing press, whether it's television, whether it's radio. It can start off very like crazy and then sort of calm down. And I am a tech optimist, actually, even though I seem like it. I don't like concentration of power, and wherever there's concentration of power, bad things happen. It just never turns out well. And so that's what I worry about, is this concentration of power and decision-making lying in the hands of too few people. And, for all the people that talk about, free speech, like, you really want that? You want Mark Zuckerberg to make a decision about everybody's speech. I don't, and he can't be fired. His children can't be fired. Nobody can be fired. They can't be fired. So where do we get to control? And I'll end on this last thing, and then Clay can finish up. Years ago, when the Google people were trying to buy Yahoo, they were trying to control Yahoo search. I don't know if you remember this. And I wrote a piece saying even Microsoft knew they were thugs. At least Microsoft knew they were thugs when they were doing what they were doing. And one of them called me, one of the founders, and I honestly don't remember which one of them because I never can tell them apart. And they're like, we're not bad people. Why are you saying we're bad people? We're not thugs. We're not bad people. And I said, you might be a good person. I just don't know. It's just, there's only you. And so what if a bad person got a hold of this? I have a personality where I'm like, what if blank gets a hold of this? And that's how I think about everything. And so that's where the concentration of power is, where all our problems are. None of this, all this other stuff, everyone's screaming about cancel. That's not the problem. It's that it's concentrated in the hands of the small group of people who are making decisions for everybody. And it's an addictive and necessary technology. It's necessary for your job, and it's addictive and systemically addictive. And so that, and it's not transparent. It's all problematic because of those things. If that can be removed, I love the internet. Clay?
It's going to be great when it gets in. So and Yash, I think you and I may have talked about this on your podcast. I think that one of the things that's actually changed is the bookkeeping around the internet. That as the bad stories started to build up, which everyone noticed and has commented on, we also started taking the good stories for granted. And there is, I think, particularly among, particularly on the left, whose arguments I'm obviously more attuned to, there's a sense that, say, Black Lives Matter or the Me Too movement are just the kind of effusions of a thirst for human justice that takes over from time to time, whereas Donald Trump was created by people sharing rare pepes on 4chan. But Black Lives Matter was a phrase you first used on Facebook. Me Too is literally a hashtag. that in fact, the coordinating capabilities of the network apply all across the political spectrum. But even under 4 years of Trump, and possibly forced as a counterreaction, the country has become dramatically more liberal on certain issues in that same period. And I think looking back in 10 years, we will remember the Women's March on Washington the day after Trump's inauguration as being a harbinger of something that actually was longer lasting than Trump's inauguration itself. That may happen, that may not happen. But if I was going to predict it 10 years looking back, there was some short-term stuff and the long-term stuff turned out better. It's that ability to coordinate around social issues. And because social cohesion across groups, the ability to form larger, looser coalitions is right now a basically left-wing attitude, since the right wing is in the US more ethno-nationalist. I think that 10 years from now, that may be part of the story we tell ourselves about this era looking back.
Well, listen, it's impossible to answer all the questions about as big a topic as this, but I think we've made real intellectual progress actually over the last hour. And that's thanks to the two of you, Kara Swisher and Clay Shirky, as well as the great members of our audience. I hope to see you all at another Persuasion event soon. Bye,
Thank
everybody.
you, Ashton. Thank you for the invite.